Okay, I think we're ready to start. Hi everyone, I'm Amanda Mackenzie. I'm the CEO of the Climate Council. Thank you for joining us for tonight's webinar. And I'd like to just begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting on today. And for me, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I want to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to acknowledge that the deep and enduring connection to the country. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And I invite you to share in the chat what land around our great country you're joining us from today. Now, of course, as you know, this session is about reflections on the election, and the results are in. Australians have voted for a future powered with renewables in overwhelming numbers and have rejected policies that would take us backwards on climate action, particularly nuclear, which bombed at the ballot. So thank you so much for your incredible support in whatever way that came across. Together, we cut through a tidal wave of misinformation from actors funded by the fossil fuel industry. And there's a number of reflections that we've had since that time, particularly that that climate change is now a fixture of Australian elections, that there's a large voting bloc that's really prioritising climate champions. Three-quarters of Gen Z and millennial voters put climate in their top voting issues, and that's now the biggest voting bloc in Australia. Of course, as you know, the federal coalition had a sweeping defeat, and that points to the federal coalition being unelectable until it can advance policies on climate and energy that are genuinely credible. The ALP had a 17 percentage point lead over the coalition when voters were asked who was the most trusted to address the climate crisis. So it shows how much credibility there is to make up for the federal coalition, who, of course, today voted Susan Ley as their new leader. Incumbent community independents held on largely, and there was a wave of challenges with strong climate credentials that came really close in about another 10 seats. So the ALP has a very strong mandate, probably the strongest since the end of World War II, to roll out renewable power, storage, better regulate polluters, and set new, stronger climate targets, all things that they went to the election with. So although we're not under any illusions that the ALP will do everything we want on climate change, of course, they did approve numerous fossil fuel projects during the last term. They do have a range of strong climate policies on renewables, on storage, on transport, and we will need to work hard to up their game on fossil fuels. So we believe that our efforts made a real difference, and thank you for the efforts you made around the election and for your support. I think together we have secured a cleaner, safer future. And just to give you an example, the nuclear scheme alone would have increased pollution by about 2 billion tonnes. So it wasn't a small difference between the major parties. So thank you for standing with us through the process. And this session, we really wanted to unpack the result and what it means for climate action. So I've got some wonderful speakers with me tonight. I am joined by Advocacy Director for the Climate Council, Alex Engel-Mellon. So she's going to break down what the Albanese government's policies are, their track record on climate, and what we see as the unique opportunities for this term. Professor Tim Flannery is with us, and he's going to talk through the mandate the government has and what that can mean for clean energy over time, for green metals. But first, we're going to hear from Dinah Arndt, who's our Head of Strategic Communications that you may have heard from before. Dinah's going to break down how the election played out, the influence of climate and energy on voter behaviour, which she's done a lot of research on, and specifically how the Climate Council's contributed to the outcome. So Dinah, Alex, Tim are all going to stay on for a panel discussion in the second half of the session. So we've had a bunch of questions already submitted prior to the webinar going ahead, but really encourage you to jump on and put in your questions in the chat. There's particularly a Q&A box which you can input your questions, and we've got our data analyst Ben McLeod, who's also going to be beavering away behind the scenes to answer lots of questions as well, but we'll try and get to as many as possible during the actual webinar too. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Dinah to come and share her screen and give us a little bit of her summary on what happened and what our influence was.
Thanks for having me, and it's great to help unpack what's just happened, because there's so much to unpack. I'm joining this call from the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present also. So I think we all understand that the climate crisis is around us. So in some ways, it wasn't a surprise to see the electoral plans disrupted by Tropical Cyclone Alfred. We were very quick to respond to this major event and explain the climate connections between cyclones. And it's so important for people across Australia not only to understand that climate change is here already with us, but already also to understand how it's harming us today. I think the other reflection I have on this moment was really around the Prime Minister, and it was telling to see the Prime Minister jump into action around this event and be standing alongside the Queensland Premier, reassuring people in the firing line that our emergency response was ready to go. I think in politics, they often say that you're defined as much by your opposition as you are by your own positions. And it was very telling to see the Prime Minister trying to stand very far apart from his predecessor and former opponent in Scott Morrison, who, decision to take that Hawaiian holiday while bushfires were engulfing our country was really emblematic of that particular party and government. And that they had ignored the science and were very ill prepared for worsening climate disasters. So in my mind, this marked actually a real turning point in fortune for both parties. And we saw throughout the campaign really a 180-degree turn in fortunes for the two major parties. So heading into this election, there were a number of promises that one of the major parties would announce, quickly followed by the other major party matching that policy. And I think we often hear from voters who are quite frustrated not to be able to tell the difference between the major parties on quite a number of issues. But I think going into this election, there was a clear divide between the major parties on climate and energy. And some of those differences were really stark. And that was something that the Climate Council found when we did our assessment both of the 47th Parliament as well as the promises that the major parties were going into this election with. That was also a difference that was exposed on national television during the leadership debate when Dutton was directly asked whether the impacts of climate change were impacting on Queensland and worsening. And he really struggled to both demonstrate that he understood, accepted the science and really showed him up during that debate. So pretty extraordinary to think in 2025 that someone would be in that sort of position. And I think as a science-backed organisation, we were very quick to respond to this. And both the media and the Prime Minister were very quick to jump on it as well. So to, again, refer back to the way that Peter Dutton presented this election, he actually referred to it himself as a referendum on energy. And when we look at the choice that voters had between those two energy policies of the major parties, there were very clear choices for people to make. On the one hand, you had the ALP that had started progressing down a pathway and went to the election with a clear plan to double renewable energy and storage by 2030. In contrast, the coalition had cooked up a scheme that was supposedly about building nuclear reactors, but for many, many years to come would mean ramping up coal and gas pollution. So when you look across the results, when you look across the polling and the research, you can see that Australians overwhelmingly endorse the path we're already on. It was cool to see just after the election, we saw the latest stats and 43% of our national grid is now being powered by renewable energy and storage. And I think we often get told about a divide between the city and country. You don't see that here. And I think the other thing that was interesting during this campaign was some very divisive debates that were happening in regions where offshore wind had been proposed. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see in a number of those electorates where the offshore wind debate raged most prominently, the vote for the coalition actually eroded. So that didn't gain any traction during this election. People just weren't buying it. The other side to this, of course, was the question of nuclear, and we didn't really see much of this scheme throughout the official election campaign, and many media commentators started to notice that the coalition candidates were distancing themselves from this policy. We saw in Peter Dutton's budget in reply speech referencing gas many, many times over and nuclear very rarely, and so trying to reframe the energy policy as being all about gas. It was one of the most high-profile policy offerings, one of the most expensive, but Peter Dutton chose not to visit a single site that was flagged for nuclear reactors. So if you look at these results, it kind of tells you why that tactical choice was made. Nuclear was a key voter concern. It was a major turnoff for women. It was a toxic policy amongst the undecideds and was really a key reason why the federal coalition was defeated in this election campaign. So as we all know, climate, cost of living, was central to this election. But what I think two things get missed in that. One is that so often solutions to climate are also cost of living solutions. And the other aspect to that is in the same way that, people can be concerned about the economy as well as their own families, we can also be concerned about climate change at the same time that we're concerned about cost of living. So we knew going into this campaign that for a lot of voters, it was really a new, threshold question for them. Can I trust this government to manage the economy? Am I reassured that they actually have a plan for cutting climate pollution? Is a bit of a threshold question for a growing number of voters. So we went into this campaign with 4 goals. The first was to keep climate change front and centre as much as we could in this context. The second was building a clear case for more renewable energy and storage. The third was pushing back against polluting policies like nuclear and gas. And the fourth was advocating for clear commitments from, across the political spectrum. And you can see some of the numbers here on the slides are just indicative of just how busy our team has been throughout this election campaign. And on the left-hand side, you'll see a number of stories that the Climate Council got out there, but on the right-hand side, you'll also see there's a number of voices and stories that were shared via others through the Media Centre as well. But we reached a huge number of people with our information, our analysis, and our advertising. In terms of outcomes, I think there are 3 outcomes that really stand out to me. And the first is just around, as Amanda referenced, that renewables mandate. I like to think of climate as a bit of like the political furniture now. Not only did Australians vote for a future powered by renewables, not only did they reject the toxic policies that were put forward, but we saw that climate is essentially central to the election in a way that was a bit different to last time round, but in no sense is less important. The second was around the $2.3 billion commitment that was secured, and we have been lobbying quite hard with the government and across the political spectrum to build not only our renewable energy capacity, but also the storage capacity. And I think that policy win, can't be underestimated. That's a huge win. It will result in 1 million more household and business batteries getting installed only in the next 5 years. And that means a lot, not only for the people that are getting the direct benefits of those batteries, but also around shoring up a more reliable system that also puts downward pressure on those peak demand times and costs for everyone. And the third point is really, as again, Amanda referenced at the beginning, was the climate harm and pollution that we've actually avoided. And we spent a lot of time equipping not only media and candidates, but also voters with the facts of how travelling down the path, the option that we did have to turn around, would have had devastating consequences for climate and all of us. And the last point is really just around the ultimate outcome. And I think these days we should consider climate less as a specific priority issue and more of a fundamental threshold that all political candidates need to jump over. And I think we would want to be seeing absolutely every political party putting forward their best policies for climate, and we'd love to see all of us arguing over those. We're not quite there yet, but if you look across this parliament, you can see we've got 64% of MPs in the House of Representatives wanting more climate action. We also have Labor and the Greens, in the Senate, and able to work together to get some really good outcomes. So Australians gifted the ALP its strongest mandate, and they did go to this election with a whole heap of policies in this area that will be good to see rolled out. But there was also a really big general swing towards progressive pro-climate parties and independents. And I think anyone that thinks that climate is on the fringe or that climate is somehow going to disappear next election or the election after that, I think is really kidding themselves. Thanks, Amanda.
Oh, thanks so much. Thanks, Dinah. And there's been a lot of questions coming through as you've been speaking. I thought I'd just bring you one of them before we get to the panel a little bit later on. Martin and Caroline and some others have spoken about how can we bring rural communities along with us in the renewable transition. Particularly during this election, we saw a variety of different campaigns opposing offshore wind, for instance, and other things. What advice would you give?
Well, I think what we've seen happen so far is people trying to politically leverage the legitimate concerns or questions that people have about any change that happens in their local area. So I think that a lot of this comes down to renewable energy companies actually doing business differently, and that's genuinely engaging with communities. And I think where you see projects that deliver, tangible community benefits for those that are living alongside those projects, I think you get really high social license and really good outcomes. So to my mind, it's part of it is about explaining the importance of transmission towers that is a climate solution, but part of it is also about genuinely engagement with communities. And I think there's some organisations that are doing a lot of advocacy and work around the idea of things like energy community hubs, where you can have people get clear information and have all their questions answered, because I think where there is a vacuum of information, you can be guaranteed that mis and disinformation will fill that vacuum.
Thanks, Dinah. So we have had a bit of time in the Climate Council to reflect on what this election means for climate action and what the Parliament may or may not do. So I'm going to invite our Advocacy Director, Alex Engelmelin, to share her insights into the climate promises the ALP has made and how we can translate that into getting as much action on climate change as possible this term and maybe another term, given the Labor Party's very extensive win on a couple of weekends ago.
Oh, great. Thanks, Amanda. And thanks everyone for joining us on giving up your Tuesday evening to discuss this with us. Really appreciate you all being here. So I thought I'd start by just taking a quick look at the new balance of power in this government and start with the big picture here. So we obviously have an ALP majority now in the lower house, a strong majority, and the largest ALP caucus since Federation, which is pretty remarkable. And this gives the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, a really stable and strong leadership position, which is a real shift from just months ago when his polling was pretty shaky. Despite the majority, independents will definitely continue to play an important role in the term ahead, particularly in shaping public discourse and keeping the pressure on around climate and accountability. The reality is that they were influential in the last term too, even though Labor had a majority then, albeit a slim one. In terms of what happened in the Senate, 40 of the 76 seats were contested this election. And while votes are still being finalised, Labor looks set to hold at least 28 of those seats and the Greens 11, which gives both of those parties, the Labor and the Greens, the numbers to pass legislation without relying on crossbenchers. So this obviously elevates and solidifies the Greens as key brokers in the upper house, where they can trade support for stronger legislation on issues like climate, which we saw them do in the last term. And senators like David Pocock, while no longer crucial to the numbers, the practical numbers themselves, they still carry real influence, especially in public commentary and issues framing. Other shifts of significance, I think it's worth calling out, is there are a few, but a key one is that there are a record number of women that have been elected to Parliament, especially from Labor in Queensland. And in the House, we'll beat the previous record of 58 women from the last election. And in the Senate, women could hold up to 44 out of the 76 seats, which is pretty remarkable. And that matters and is interesting because our research shows, and others' research shows, that women are more likely to be concerned about climate change and support climate action. So this could potentially really help build parliamentary momentum on climate issues, and that will remain to be seen in the term ahead. In terms of like a quick touch on ministries, Chris Bowen obviously continues as Minister for Climate and Energy, and Murray Watt replaces Tanya Plibersek as Environment Minister, which is a potentially important shift, especially in tone and focus for the government in the environmental portfolio. But what does this all mean for climate influence in this term? Well, there are a few pretty key implications. First, it's important to note that the Labor caucus becomes more central and important in this scenario. So with a lower house majority, most of the action to progress policy and legislation shifts internally within the party. Once they get caucus support, they only need Greens support in the Senate to pass new legislation. So that creates a streamlined path through Parliament to progress stronger climate laws and action, and there is no need for government to do multiple deals with crossbenchers. Second, I think it's worth noting that this is a government clearly interested in legacy, and Anthony Albanese made that clear on election night in his speech, and he has tied that legacy to renewables and climate action to at least some degree. And this gives us a clear opportunity to push for ambition through both direct advocacy and via public and media pressure. But before we talk more about that, let's take a really quick look at what Labor actually took to the election in terms of climate and energy policy. So explicit policy commitments included, they said that they'd meet their 2030 emissions target and they'd set a 2035 target, although they didn't say what this would be. They said that they'd bid to host the next COP in Adelaide with Pacific Island nations, and a decision is expected on that next month. They also, as Dinah has touched on, committed to the $2.3 billion battery storage commitment, which is a major policy win, which you all helped secure. And I would just add to Dinah's comments that we received direct acknowledgement that our advocacy helped build the runway for this announcement from Chris Bowen's Chief of Staff. So huge win there. While Labor didn't add anything new to their renewables and storage plan beyond this batteries announcement, they did repeatedly reinforce their commitment to continuing the ambitious agenda from the last term, including their renewable energy target of 83%, their Future Made in Australia investment, and obviously their firm opposition to nuclear. They also committed, as a couple of side things, to introduce a federal Environment Protection Agency to take on companies and people who breach the law, which many of you will know they committed to in the previous term, but didn't deliver. And they also committed to creating a stockpile of critical minerals, which are used in advanced manufacturing, that could potentially be a bargaining chip in future trade talks. But other than this, Labor's commitments on climate and energy were largely a commitment to continue policies from their previous term, which I've dubbed here as their overhang commitments. And examples of this are the limits on industrial polluters via the safeguard mechanism and the reform pathway for that, the review pathway, sorry, the new vehicle efficiency standards, which come into force fully in the middle of this year, next month. And the National Climate Risk Assessment and Adaptation Plan, which we understand are completed but not yet released by the government. So those are some of the overhanging commitments. So what are some of the key opportunities ahead, and where do we come in? So there are definitely some real opportunities this term. This is a government with a clear interest in legacy setting, which indicates high ambition. Energy, as Diana mentioned, featured strongly in the campaign, and climate change certainly also featured, with the ex-Cyclone Alfred comments from Albanese, as well as the leaders' debate response to Dutton's "I'm not a scientist" gaffes. And the other thing I'd note is that their current policy commitments, i.e. saying we'll continue our commitments from last term, means that their commitments are relatively elastic. So, for example, they've committed to a 2035 emissions target, but not yet a number. They've committed to reviewing the safeguard mechanism, but haven't committed to what changes they might make to it. And this gives them room to move and provides us with opportunities to push them to go further than they otherwise might. But there are obviously some risks too, and the main ones that I'll call out here with limited time are really the extent to which they will be ambitious versus adopting a play it safe approach. It's yet to be seen what the balance of that will look like, and certainly our role to make sure it veers to ambition rather than playing it safe. And the other major call out would be on fossil fuels, that we haven't seen any clear ambition to end new fossil fuel or gas project approvals or reduce our exports and factor in Scope 3 emissions. So it's certainly going to be a challenge to determine how we address this strategically, and it's something that we're actively thinking about as a live issue right now. And our role is clear. We will continue to define and evidence public and voter mandate for stronger climate action in the immediate term. And on the screen here, you can see an immediate tactic we used to do this. We ran this ad in the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age and across our socials, backing in Labor's mandate with a positive message, but also highlighting the importance of climate change to their voter base. With such a strong Labor majority, a big part of our role will now be to push Labor to be more ambitious. And this includes by building our influence with existing and new ministers, and also Labor backbenchers and that Labor caucus that I mentioned have an increased influence and role in the coming term. And final slide, I'll wrap up here, but here are just a flavour of some big things on the horizon for us from a political and policy advocacy perspective that we've been already actively thinking about in terms of our strategic focus over the next 3 to 6 years, with the biggest ones in the near term being how do we get the strongest possible 2035 emissions target out of the government? And how do we utilise a potential successful COP bid to get Labor to go big and go hard? So yeah, I'll wrap it up there and we'll move back to you, Amanda.
Thanks, Alex. That was great. And Alex, I'm interested in your perspective on how we're placed in this environment. Obviously, it's different to the last federal term, but there's a lot of continuation as well. What are you sort of excited about for the Climate Council?
Well, look, I've only been at the Climate Council for about 9 months, Amanda, but as a relative newcomer from my government has been in New South Wales government and government circles, but I've been incredibly impressed by the depth of the Climate Council's strategic communications and campaigns expertise, which I think places us in a very strong position to have influence on and shape both the media and public conversation in the near and longer term. I think our second strength, which I'm excited about, given the election outcome, would be our relationships leading into this next term. We've got really strong relationships with key Labor ministry members, with the Greens and with key members of the crossbench, which will be critical for influencing this government. And the last thing I'd say is I'm really excited about previous work we've done and about our the science and policy expertise that we have, which I think is best demonstrated through our foundational piece of work last year in Seize the Decade, which many of our supporters would know is our evidence-based plan to cut climate pollution 3 times faster than current government plans out to 2030. And this kind of foundational work places us in a really strategic position to influence government, and this government particularly, which has signalled that it strongly believes in the science of climate and it wants to set a legacy for future generations. So yeah, I think those would be the key things for me.
Thanks, Alex. It's not going to be a small task. Just before I go to Tim, one question that's been coming up a lot is around native forest logging, forestry in general. Obviously, we've been talking a lot about renewables, whether you think there's scope in the Labor platform to do anything in that regard.
I love when you throw me these tricky questions out of the blue. Look, I think that there is. I think they will certainly be part of the picture. But I think as our Seize the Decade report notes, there are still some really big chunks in terms of sectoral pathways in energy, in industry, in transport that have huge opportunities for emissions abatement and to cut climate pollution as quickly as we need to. And an organisation like ours with quite limited resources will have to decide kind of where we need to kind of lean in and focus our energy. And there's still some massive fights on the horizon in terms of the anti-renewables movement. You know, we've just seen the National Party come out and confirm that they might even continue support for nuclear, that they see their strengthened vote in the regions as an endorsement of their nuclear policies and their anti-renewable stance. So there'll be some really strong battles in some of those areas. So whilst I think there are opportunities in the ag sector and other related issues, I'm not sure that that's necessarily where the Climate Council will be best placed to, you know, as a largely like communications and policy influencing organisation, that's where our energies are best placed with limited resources.
Thanks, Alex. Tim, I invite you to turn on your camera now too. And just to kind of pepper you with a few questions now. Just to firstly, how are you feeling after the election?
Look, it's just great to see you, Amanda, and great to be here
Nice.
with all of our supporters post-election. Look, I guess for me, it is an enormous sense of relief. Can you imagine if it had gone the other way? We'd be sitting here kind of pondering how in the hell are we going to deal with this nonsensical policy mix? So yeah, relief and also a sense of really wanting to get on with the job now. I think that, you know, the Climate Council can play a really significant role in terms of driving this energy transition as fast and as hard as it can go. And we can do a lot in the next 3 years.
Yeah, I agree with you, surprisingly enough. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about when we were talking earlier before this webinar about legacy that Labor could leave behind, and what is the scale of a mandate that they could end up with 2 terms of government from here.
Sure. Well, look, you know, it's important to understand we're, you know, 40% of the way into greening at least the electricity grid, maybe 45% by now. By, you know, 3 years from now, it's possible if we pushed hard, we'd be at 65, 70% even, you know, and that would mean game over in a way for the debate about clean energy. Most of the job would have been done. So in terms of legacy, you know, greening the grid, hugely important, but the opportunities don't just finish there. There's the you know, electrification of transport. And again, the government's made some initial important moves in that area. And, oh, could I just go back, Amanda, to the grid and just say the battery, the home battery subsidy will, I think, turn out to be far more important than most of us realise. It's got the potential even to limit the requirements of transmission, because we've got a lot more storage, local storage. So I'm watching that one closely, but I'm really heartened that the Labor Party has backed that policy in and won the election. The third area is, of course, the industry. And, you know, we have so many opportunities here. And again, Labor has made some moves to do things. There's been a support for a shift to renewables in the aluminium sector was announced just a few months before the election. There's the support for green steel in South Australia. But there's also this bigger picture, this opportunity of minerals processing in Australia using clean energy sources. That won't happen overnight. But if we can build as a legacy the platform upon which that industry will prosper, the Labor Party will have done something wondrous, because really it's one of the key ways that we can make sure that our imports are limited. I mean, if what we need to do is limit demand for fossil fuels, and I can't imagine Australia doing anything more impactful than building that clean energy base for manufacturing and minerals processing. That would be really huge.
Mm. Yeah, and I think we'll get to speaking a bit more in a minute with the other panelists around how we get fossil fuels out of the system. But I think what we've certainly seen in Labor in the last term is a much stronger focus on getting new, positive, clean things into the system. They've been very reluctant to work directly on moving fossil fuels out of the system. So we're going to have a much more of an open door where we can be enhancing those policies that get more of the good stuff in, which ruin the business case for fossil fuels, if you like, rather than the other way around, which doesn't mean we shouldn't have to do that as well, but we should. And I was very pleased to hear you mention the batteries, Tim, because obviously we worked very hard on that one too. The government is making a bid for COP31, the United Nations Climate Conference, to be hosted in Australia at the end of 2026. Now that they are, elected, what do you think the opportunity is for that COP to number one, to be held in Australia and the Pacific, but then accelerate Australia's action?
Well, could I just say first, Amanda, I think it's really important that it's being held in Adelaide, because Adelaide is where Australia's clean energy future started to be built. People forget that the Rann government won 5 elections in a row, the Rann Labor government. When they started, there was virtually no renewable energy in the system. By the time they finished, the transition was mostly done. So, it's great they're holding it there. It's also very important because Australia's Indigenous communities really have a kind of a focus in Adelaide, a centre for people to come to. And this is going to be a joint COP, we hope, with the Pacific nations. So I can imagine Australia mounting a COP with the help of the Pacific nations that has a truly Indigenous kind of focus, if you want. And that's what the world needs right now, among the many things the world needs. But it would be great if Australia could do that. It's potentially an enormously important meeting. Unfortunately, time is very short to plan the meeting properly, because Turkey has been sort of holding its cards very close to its chest for too long. But we could do something marvelous with this COP. We really could. It'll be the first time we'd host it. I think, as I said, that it's shaping up very well for that engagement. The one thing we will need, though, is to come to that meeting with a genuine sense of humility and comradeship with our Pacific nations. It would be a disaster were Australia to stand up and say it's our COP sort of thing, and the Pacific Islanders are just helping out a bit. We need to come in a genuinely consensual way, because those nations have a lot to offer.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I invite Alex and Dinah to turn on your cameras too. And I'm going to give you all one of the biggest questions that's been coming through for the night, and certainly something that we've been talking a lot about. This is from Joe, it's from Ian, David, Carrie, Mark Edwards, others that have been in the various chats. And essentially they all come around to how can we persuade the ALP to stop approving new fossil fuel projects, and how can we persuade the ALP to be going beyond renewables to where pollution is coming from in other sectors of the economy. So who wants to tackle that one first? Diana, I'm going to go. Oh, Alex, you turned off your mute, so you get to go first.
Damn it. Look, it's the big question, I think. It's the $1 million question. And a couple of ways to answer it. One, I think we have seen this election. Australians have given the ALP a really firm mandate to go further and faster on cutting climate pollution. So it's now necessary for us to do everything we can to help pave the way for them to build on and significantly strengthen what they've done to date, to get to what the action we actually need that's required by the science. So strategically, I think our approach is thinking about how we can position climate and how we get to start thinking about fossil fuel new project approvals, exports, addressing those things as being a sensible, centrist, safe thing to do. And that's not an easy task, and there'll need to be a variety of approaches that we take to do that. But I think that's kind of our thinking and our main sort of overarching strategy overall, because we've seen that when they think about climate and when they think about policies as being sensible, centrist, and safe from the electorate, they're happy to act, and we might be able to push them a bit further. So I think that's about us leaning partly in a couple of ways, and that could be about looking at exposing more for the Australian public about how little economic contribution some of our export industries like gas actually make to the economy, and kind of undermining that social license of, you know, big fossil fuel polluters, and revealing kind of more publicly what kind of subsidies they actually get from current government funding mechanisms. So that's like the kind of fight back, as we call it, approach. And on the other hand, it's about how do we show Australians what the alternative is for our economy? How do we show what the opportunities and the pathway ahead is in our green metals, in our green economy? How do we kind of illustrate that for the everyday Australian that currently might just think about our export industries like gas and coal as being really fundamental parts of our economy? So that they're the kind of things that we're thinking about at the moment.
Dinah, did you want to build on that?
I was going to say very, very similar sentiments, but I think for me, it's really shifting that Overton window. And right now, and in the recent past, I don't think the ALP has thought it is politically possible for them to do it. And it's our job to shift that window fundamentally, so that they understand where the public appetite is at, but also what is politically possible and what is scientifically necessary. We have no time to lose on this, and it's a big job. But I think if you look back to 5 years ago, 10 years ago, we were told a lot of other things would be impossible, and I think we have proven people wrong. So I think we can do that again.
Thanks, Dinah. Tim, what strikes you as being the opportunity here?
Well, look, I couldn't agree more with Dinah that the government, and every government in Australia up to this point, has seen it as just not politically feasible to do this. That's one big problem, and we can really play a huge role there. In fact, that should be, in some ways, our principal role, building that community consensus that this is possible. But secondly, you know, the argument that if we don't export, someone else will simply sell the stuff. How are we going to counter that? So I think, you know, the counter for that is building this clean energy future, this clean minerals processing, where we can demonstrate that, in fact, we don't need fossil fuels to have a viable industrial base. So that's where I'd be focusing on. This is not going to be easy. It's not going to be done overnight. But I think that Dinah's hit the nail on the head in terms of our role in that. There's no point just hammering away at government saying you've got to do it, you've got to do it, you've got to do it, if they believe in their heart that it's impossible to destroy their government. So it's going to be a long and hard road, but the Climate Council has a critical role in terms of this.
And thank you all. And I think what I'd add to that is, I suppose, our strategy, as well as being a communication strategy, is how do we augment the policy environment to make life more difficult for fossil fuel projects? So the safeguard mechanism has come in and it's relatively weak compared to what we would want it to be. But a reform around offsets in the safeguard mechanism, for instance, which is the get out of jail free card for fossil fuel projects. If you change that, you make life more difficult for fossil fuel projects. Similarly, if you have more restrictions on methane, a lot of these fossil fuel projects emit huge amounts of methane out of them. So if they had to properly account for the methane, that's another cost on their balance sheet. So it's sort of a death by 1,000 cuts strategy, making life more difficult for these projects, because it is probably politically too difficult to do the one thing that would be the easiest or the neatest. A ban on all new fossil fuel projects would be great, but politically there's no way we're going to get that done. So yeah, it's tricky. Tim, another question for you. Don asks how Australia could potentially bring investment from the United States, given Trump is undermining the climate policies there, to help us on this journey that you described for Australia to become a superpower.
Mm. Look, I'm not an expert in all of this sort of stuff, I must say, but I do know that there are some really key developments happening in the US, and people from those initiatives have been visiting Australia. So one of them is, the development of minerals processing, particularly iron ore at very low temperatures. There's some new technology coming out of Boston that looks extremely interesting. I know they have been visiting here in Australia, and I think there's a great opportunity there for government to engage, and perhaps some of our companies, iron ore groups, to engage. But maybe we'll find with the hostile environment in the US that more money will flow to Australia anyway as a result of that shutting down of opportunity in the US. I mean, it's tragic, horrible to see, but it may offer us an unexpected windfall.
Mm. Thanks, Tim. And there's been quite a few questions about the implications of the Greens losing seats. And of course, Adam Bandt has been a really strong climate champion for many years. He's been in the parliament for 15 years, so it was quite notable that he has lost his seat. Alex, can you tell us what you think about the implications are? What does it mean in terms of the electorate's view, as well as what does it mean for climate action in the parliament?
Sure, Amanda. Look, I think obviously it was devastating for many, the news of Adam losing his seat. And yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge what a champion he has been in Parliament and with the crossbench on climate action. But overall, I'd say the Greens had really mixed results, and there were lots of factors at play in that, many of which I think were unrelated to climate and environment policy issues for them. What's clear is that their national primary vote largely held up. So 2025, the result just now was their highest, second highest after the last 2022 election. So whilst a lot of the media reported it was a devastating loss for them, and they did lose those 3 lower house seats, you could argue that they were pretty lucky to win those seats anyway in the last election. And on the flip side, they have now won the lower house seat of Ryan at the end of the day, and they now hold hold the balance of power in the Senate, which, as I mentioned before, does provide that path to pass stronger climate laws through the upper house. So overall, what I'd emphasize is that whilst the story of Adam and the 3 lower house seats was bad, overall, the national primary vote held up and the Greens performed quite strongly. And I don't think their performance in any way suggests that voters didn't vote for climate action. As Diana said, we know firmly climate change is now a fixture of Australian elections, and there's a large voting bloc that prioritises climate champions at the ballot box. Climate concern has remained persistently high in spite of a cost of living crunch. And for ALP voters, climate change was a top 2 issue in this election. Pro-climate independents won more votes than ever before. So yeah, look, I wouldn't lose hope on climate because of the Greens result. And overall, I'm looking forward to seeing the strong role that they play in this next parliamentary term.
Thanks, Alex. Dinah, there's a few questions coming through around about how we bring the community with us on this journey. And we've talked about rural and regional communities, but there's other questions around those in the lower socioeconomic quartiles, particularly with cost of living being such a big concern in the last election. So how do we find solutions that are both addressing cost of living, making life easier for families and communities, as well as addressing the climate crisis at the same time?
Yeah, well, I think, again, we often, I think, overestimate the differences between different cohorts of people in Australia. And on climate, there isn't as much difference as you would expect if you look at electorates where we say have a teal or climate, champion independent holding that seat, who reheld that seat in some inner city areas of Sydney or Melbourne. and you compare that to the outer suburban electorates, there isn't actually that much difference between people's perspectives. I think sometimes there's more difference in terms of what's front of mind when people are voting, or what they're prioritising when people are voting. But if you actually dig in and talk to people about their views, there's not actually that much difference. I think what you pointed to, Amanda, is exactly the case. I think it's not so much about telling someone something new. It's actually just telling them again and again what we know to be true, which is that climate solutions are also cost of living solutions. And whether you look at, active transport, public transport, and, giving people more options to get around, if you look at, Brisbane and how dramatically they increased train and bus patronage when they made 50-cent fares in trains in Brisbane, or you look at something like rooftop solar or a household battery. Like, I think it's about making those solutions accessible to as many people as possible. And we've certainly been looking at cohorts that are missing out to date, like renters and people that live in apartments and those kinds of things. And I think that is part of our role. Part of our role is about making sure that those solutions are accessible and equitably shared amongst the community, that the benefits are realised by all of us, not just certain segments of our community. And I think if we can do that, I think that those solutions will sell themselves. We don't have to do that job.
Thanks, Dinah. There's quite a few questions as well on gas that have come through in the chat and in the questions. Alex, can you speak to what you think the ALP's intention is on gas and what we see as the role of gas in the transition?
Look, Labor has been pretty clear on the role of gas in their energy transition plan, in that it would play a firming role and a dwindling role over time, but an important firming role in the near term to back up renewables and storage. And that was very different to the LNP's plan, which was about rapidly ramping up gas and fast-tracking approvals for new gas projects. So I think that their position on the dwindling role of gas for our own domestic use is pretty clear. I think it remains to be seen what their position is and how flexible they might be in thinking about the domestic reservation policies that the LNP pulled out of their pocket and surprised us with in the lead up to the election. So that one remains to be seen and was a bit of a wild card. But look, I think the fundamental challenge for us is to get Labor to take a long, hard look at their policies on fossil fuel project approvals, which at a federal level is largely looking at offshore gas projects and our gas exports. And Climate Council has done a lot of work on this in terms of what a good gas policy would look like. And we were quite concerned when the Labor government last term released their future gas strategy, and we did a lot of work with them on amending their approach at the time. But I think that will be one of the big policy challenges and fights for us in the term ahead. And we're very actively thinking about what we might need to be doing from a public-facing campaign perspective versus a inside track policy engagement perspective and policy analysis perspective on gas. And a big part of that is obviously, as I mentioned, setting a strong target and in the first instance, and maybe looking at policy areas and initiatives that are already underway in terms of like the safeguard mechanism. How could we kind of adopt that death by 1,000 cuts approach to help lay the groundwork and runway for Labor to address this issue of gas. And in David Pocock's words, we don't have a gas. Our gas problem is an export problem, not a supply problem. We've got so much gas, more than we need, and we're selling it at rock bottom prices to foreign interests. So that's our position, and we'll be very live and active on gas over the coming term.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Tim, you mentioned Mike Rann's legacy in South Australia and that he had 5 terms. I wondered if you were having dinner with Anthony Albanese tonight and you were offering some reflections on how a government might fundamentally change economy and their energy status. What do you think you'd say to Albo?
Well, I think I'd say have a talk to Mike Rann. I lived in South Australia for 7 years as the transition was going on. And Mike was always there saying, this state we haven't got much coal, but we've got plenty of sunlight and wind. Was just truths that everybody knew. And they set up after a bit of a bumpy start, some very, very good consultative mechanisms with local communities in terms of developing wind power and solar. And, we all actually anticipated that gas may be quite a substantial part of the energy mix. It turns out every year we look at it, there's less and less requirement for gas, simply because of batteries and the deployment of the renewables. So I'd say if you want to stay popular, you want to understand how it's done, have a word with Mike Rann and just see what can be done. So it is, building on our strengths. People know what Australia's strengths are. Nuclear power isn't one of them. You know, and gas is so abstract and offshore, it's not really there either. But wind and solar, we all understand it. We all understand minerals processing. And we all now, thank God, understand electric vehicles. So I would be taking a kind of patriotic view that we're building on Australia's strengths.
Thanks, Tim. And just to finish us off, because we're coming close to time, I wanted to ask each speaker, what is sort of really getting you excited when you think about the next term of Parliament in how we can progress climate action? So, Dinah, I might start with you.
Well, I am quite excited about taking on the gas industry. It's a behemoth in this country, and I think they've done quite the marketing job on us. And a lot of the myths that they have sent around are really persistent and pervasive. If you go out and talk to people, they'll tell you that gas is somehow cleaner than coal. They probably won't even realise gas is a fossil fuel. They certainly don't realise that it's harmful to our health directly. If you have a gas cooktop in your kitchen, get it out now. And so I think there's a big job for us to do in actually bringing along the community with us on that point. And I think that's a big comms job. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Thanks. Alex?
Well, look, Amanda, I'm a political and policy nerd, and I've worked on political advocacy campaigning for most of my career. And I'm excited to be so supported by an organisation of comms experts that are able to get my nerdy policy analysis out into the world and in front of stakeholders and in front of media. What I'm really excited about is the rise of new media and how that relates to the rise of new voting blocks in Australia in our younger Gen Z and millennial demographics, and the demise of Murdoch in the election campaign. I'm really excited about how we can, as an organisation, utilise our comms expertise and our social media expertise to really lean into these new forms of media and engage this much wider group of stakeholders on climate and energy issues to help shift that Overton window that we've talked about. That's what I'm really excited about.
Thanks, Alex. Tim, you get the final word.
Thank you. Well, look, I'm really looking forward to the energy transition picking up pace. I want to see that day in 2028 when we're at 70%, when there's no longer any argument, there's no climate wars, there's nothing to debate, we're there, and then we can push the other things forward. But getting that transition done, it's kind of like if someone's repairing a road in front of your house, it's like getting that completed, or everything becomes possible and you can get around. So I'm really looking forward to that.
And Matt Canavan and David Littleproud will still be saying, it's possible to go backwards. We can go backwards.
But who'd want to, Amanda?
There'll be no one following them.
No.
Thank you, everyone, for coming along tonight. That's all we've got time for. Thank you, Dinah, Alex, and Tim, for joining me. Stay up to date with us over the next few months as we really nut out our strategy going forward. And it's coming up to tax time, so you get a few emails from us about the end of financial year. We'd love your support as we go into the next year of impact and campaigning. And you'll get an email summarising this webinar and with a link to the recording that you can send on to others. So we've got no small set of challenges and opportunities ahead of us, but you can see we're pretty pumped and excited about what the opportunities are. So let's go. And thank you so much for being on this journey with us. We'll see you at the next webinar.